Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us on Zoom today. My name is Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor and pleasure of being the Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. This is a great session today. I know that as social work scholars and practitioners, writing is a critical element in your toolbox. I'm grateful to Professor Jin Gao and to Adam Pellegrini for conceiving this event to highlight the everyday writing lives of our faculty. And they serve as role models for students and everyone dialing in today. They're going to describe some of the successes they've achieved as writers, the challenges they find in writing regularly, and some helpful strategies that they've developed along the way to manage some of those challenges. We're hoping this event will inspire all of you, especially our students who've dialed in, to nurture your own writing practices in spite of the fear and pressure you may feel at times, say as a graduate student working from deadline to deadline in rapid order. In particular, in light of the impact of COVID-19 on our day-to-day lives, we thought it was particularly appropriate to sort of frame today's event around that issue and the challenges that we're experiencing in the current moment. We know that writing tasks and goals will persist through the challenges, but there are also perhaps amplified anxieties and maybe even higher stakes associated with that. So we'll delve into that right now. I'm thrilled that today we're going to be joined by faculty from across the CSSW curriculum. They're going to talk about challenges and strategies for success in their own writing lives. And our illustrious participants, panelists today include Professors Carmela Alcantara, Neeraj Kaushal, Ron Mincy, Susan Whitty, Mattia Marquardt, Director of Administration for CSSW's online campus. So, to begin, I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to take just a couple of minutes to say a few words about how they perceive writing in their own lives, a challenge they face as a writer and how they overcome it. And just for sake of simplicity, we're going to go in alphabetical order. So Carmela, I'd like to invite you to go first.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And first, I just want to thank Adam and Jin Gao, Professor Gao, for again conceiving the idea. I think we have a terrific writing center, and so it's really great to be able to contribute to these active conversations. I think especially I think in recent years have enjoyed thinking a lot about writing and learning about the science of writing, and I perceive writing as a journey, and it's not really a destination. And so it's really from this like growth framework, growth almost mindset model. And one phrase, and for students who work with me, I often talk about writing through something, like, oh, I need to write through this issue. And so I really see writing as a means for self-discovery, a means to obtain clarity in both, I think, professional and sort of personal life. And for me, as I think about just challenges, I'm a first generation person. And so for me, that means that I was the first to graduate high school, college, PhD, nonetheless to sort of have a professional career in academia. And, I add to that, that Spanish was my first language. And so English is my second language. And so I share that because I think we'll get into this a little bit today, but there's a way in which to be, I think, a good writer, you have to be vulnerable. And so one of the challenges has been addressing those insecurities related to imposter syndrome that surface in my writing and wrestling through that. And in terms of strategies, and I'm really looking forward to be able to just hear what my colleagues have to say. I think it's been really helpful just to be a part of experiences that have demystified that writing process, in part because what I mentioned before as a first generation person, or, imposter syndrome related, I think, to the English language, being able to see senior mentors and colleagues along my academic career, the way that they approach writing has been really important, and shifting and thinking about writing as a practice, as a skill, has been fundamental just to my growth. So I'll share that and stop and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks very much for sharing. Appreciate it. Neeraj, could you say a few words, please?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So thank you, Adam and Chin, for organizing this event, and thank you all of you for joining. I too, like Carmela, have English. When I started writing was not my primary language. I used to think in Hindi and then write in English, which was quite challenging. But I decided to adopt a career where I had to write a lot. In the course in any single year, I write different kinds of things. So I have, like, maybe I can put them in 4 different categories. I write grants and technical papers, which are for a very specialized audience. And there the challenge is how to motivate the issue in very few words, because the space is limited. And then also how to talk about the importance of that issue. The second thing on which I constantly write in a particular year is I write a column in a newspaper in India. And there, the challenge most of the time is that I'm competing with other writers in that newspaper. So newspapers, most of you know, people have between 15 minutes or maybe 10 minutes a day, or maybe those who read a lot, they spend a whole hour. So there the challenge is for me to be sitting in the US and writing on events that are critical to India and events that the audience in India wants to learn. So, and there I want to write in a language that the first paragraph kind of invites people into finishing the article. In fact, the title of the article becomes very important, otherwise, you know, they would just skip. The third kind of writing that I have been trying to do of late is I try to write for a more general audience on immigration, the subject that I work on. So there is not technical. One of the recent pieces I wrote was about how Indian government is using a religious lens for introducing immigration and refugee policies in India. Now, it was for an American audience, so it was a different challenge. Some of the things that I assume the Indian audience know, as an Indian, I know everybody knows I had to be far more detailed on that. So there were different challenges in this piece of writing. And the final thing that I've been, last few years, I've been engaged in writing a book on immigration, which I enjoyed very much. They were challenging when I was working on it, because I was often feeling that, you know, how am I going to finish it? But yeah, so that's it. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Niraj. Mattia, please share with us.
Thank you. And huge thanks to Adam Pellegrini and Xin Gao also. I just love the idea of having conversations about writing. And I have some links that I'll share in the chat also of things that I think have been helpful for me, or things that I hope will be helpful for you. So I'm an alum of CSSW, and I am not an academic in terms of being a professor. So I'm an administrator at the school, and I've worked in nonprofits as well. So I'm hoping that I can contribute to this panel by sharing the value of writing in a social work career that can be tangential to an academic career, or alongside an academic career, or outside an academic career. And writing really has benefited me professionally throughout my career, but I have not had a job where publishing writing was part of it. So one challenge for me is that when I write, or when I publish writing, it's always extra time. So time is an important issue, and I think everybody can relate to that, especially now. So anytime I publish something, I'm doing that in my own time, and yet it has been really worth it. So as an example, in the past, one of my first jobs outside of after my master's in social work was as the National Director of Training for a nonprofit organization. And being a director of training really has nothing to do with publishing articles, but it really helped me to establish my credibility, to develop my expertise and refine my thinking, kind of relating to what Carmela was saying about writing through and writing as a process of growth and development. It helped me connect with others in my profession and advocate for my perspectives. It also gave me a way to provide professional development for my team, because in nonprofits, you often cannot give a bonus to a team member. But a lot of my team members were very interested in publishing something, and the process of writing something together and thinking it through and then getting published together was very valuable for them, and helped them in their future careers also. And a really important bonus to publishing is getting to work with an editor. That the value of an editor is just wonderful. They take your writing, and you have to give up a little bit of control because they'll put their touch on it, but it makes it better, and it makes it more valuable for a wider audience too. So I would suggest that writing is valuable for any profession and any social worker. And it's a great way to document your work and reflect, think about how you might do things in the future, and contribute your ideas and experiences to a broader field. And for me, in this time of the pandemic, that's been kind of a stress reliever. It's a way to step back, get out of the nitty-gritty, think a little bit about ideas, and feel like I'm contributing something to the field. So recently a couple of colleagues and I published an op-ed about moving teaching online, and I'll put the link in the chat. And that was a way to feel like I had a niche expertise that could be valuable to other people, and thinking about it in this context was, it was kind of a stress reliever and kind of a way to feel like I was doing something of service. So I will stop there and look forward to more.
Terrific. Thank you, Mattia. Ron, please share something with us about your writing.
So hello, everyone. Again, thanks for holding this. For me, writing has been a hard-fought skill, which began the first summer I entered, after I entered college. I went back to my high school English instructor and showed her the comments my professor gave me on my first college paper. And those comments were, Mr. Mincy, there are a lot of compelling ideas here, but there are no sentences. So I took that paper back to my instructor in high school, and I asked her, why is it that I don't know how to write? After all, I graduated 5th in my class. I was the boy most likely to succeed, and I didn't know how to write. And she explained, because your classmates wouldn't do any homework, I never taught grammar. Today, I realize that that's one of the most pernicious forms of institutional oppression that students from low-income neighborhoods get. But at the tender age of 19, I didn't think about it in such lofty terms. I just realized it was my responsibility to figure out how to write. And I devoted much of my professional life to figuring that out. In the 70s, we had the early development of tools that you take for granted now. There was a software package called Grammatique. And I tried to use grammar books, but at Harvard, there were so many writing assignments, I didn't have time to read the writing books and to learn about sentence structure, verbs, nouns. I didn't have time to do all that. So I use these online tools because I've always been something of a computer geek. And they showed me my mistakes. And it was by the constant correcting of my mistakes that I learned to recognize when I was about to write something incorrectly, and I learned how to correct it. But the real breakthrough came for me when I was a junior professor in my first professional job. And I took a course that was on grant writing, but the course was taught by an English professor. And that was the first time. I was in my early 20s. I had already written my doctoral dissertation, and I still was not a confident writer. And she took us through what was, I could do something I had to do, but I was also learning grammar. And that's when I really learned more about the tools that one needs to teach writing. The thing I will say finally is this, and I mean this. I think that I know a lot of faculty members who will allow students who are poorly prepared for graduate study to skate by, to leave their graduate study and not know how to write. I believe firmly that those faculty members are failing those students. I would never have had the influence that I have had on my field of research and policy if I had not learned how to write. And I am grateful to my college professor who was honest with me, who told me I did not know how to write, because that made me make a commitment to a skill that I needed to acquire and do what I had to do to get it done. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. And next up, Professor Susan Whitty. Susan.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam and Chin, for this opportunity to invite us to reflect on our identities as writers. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. I guess I realize that we're as diverse as writers as we are as people and as social workers. So my writing takes many forms, and as Neeraj so beautifully described, in those forms, she described some of the challenges that are associated. So I thought I would join Ron in sharing a bit of my history, or herstory, if you will. I was invited to be a diarist in the 5th grade by a wonderful teacher. And now we would call it journaling, but then it was, Dear Diary. And that 5th grade teacher had an interest in the things, I guess, I was a loquacious kid and kind of annoying, and invited me to, appropriately, reframe the acting out to being able to reflect. So she encouraged me to write. So every day, compulsively, from the time I was 10 until I was 23, I had a diary, and to this day I have all these journals. But then, like Ron, my freshman year in college, the first English class that I took, the TA gave me a D on the first paper and essentially said I didn't know how to write. And I think that I began suffering from that imposter syndrome, and of course have kept it with me. And I guess I tell that story because I meet many students and colleagues who have this sensibility that those of us who've been successful have overcome that. And I guess what I want to say is to reassure you that I think we live with many of these challenges, and we work through them, as Carmela was saying, as a journey, and we overcome them in many of the same ways that we do as social work practitioners or as people receiving service from others. I wanted to say that I thought one of the most helpful things that overcame my fear of writing was some wonderful early mentors, including in my own practicum for my social work degree. I was doing a group with kids whose parents were living with HIV, and someone said, "Why don't you write that up?" And I thought, oh my gosh, I couldn't possibly do that, because who would care, who would listen? And so it was those messages about the importance of what we're doing, and that there are audiences out there who want to hear our voices. So as much as the craft of writing is important, so too is the reminder of to whom we're writing to, as Neeraj referred to, but also for what purpose and with what impact. And so I find that having that passion often helps me come back to a writing task. Most recently, I've been struggling with how to make sure I'm using a prop lens, because as a woman, I'm aware of some of the historical challenges that women have faced in becoming more visible, but surely people of color, as a white woman, I know I have a voice that's often heard before other colleagues. So I'm going to stop with that, but I think moving forward, my challenges have to do with decolonizing the publishing and grant writing process, and also thinking about prop lenses and how do we make sure that our work is attending to those issues.
Thank you, everyone, for some really intriguing opening statements. I'd like to just allude to what many of you have touched on, and that is you write in different styles for different audiences. And so I wonder if you could maybe jump in and tell us, as you approach different types of writing projects, do you employ different practices, or what is your routine like? What is your routine for personal writing versus professional writing? Anything of that ilk that you can share? You can jump in at any order at this point.
So one of the things that I've done in the past 3 years, my daughter-in-law introduced me to a book called Deep Work. And it talks about how one should organize their activity around the things that are most challenging to them. So, I have worked a great deal at creating a writing environment that involves having 5 hours to work on a piece of writing, getting in a place where I am not distracted, putting on instrumental music to create this zone that I get into, and being able to go through a piece of writing and writing it through, and then quitting after 5 hours, so that when I return to my writing task, I don't have to think about where I was, but I pick right up the last sentence I wrote, even if I didn't finish that sentence or finish that paragraph. I know exactly what I was trying to say, and I just go on to the next idea. I deliberately try not to finish something, but instead leave it unfinished, so that I don't have to think about what was I trying to do again. I was frustrated last night when my clock hit the hour because I couldn't express this idea. And the next morning, after having some rest and such, I'm back at it in a zone and go back to it again. And so I try to write only on the days that I can organize it in that way. So the days that I teach, the days that I have faculty meetings, it's a lost cause. I do whatever everyone expects of me on those days, so that on the days that I write, I can say with no guilt, leave me alone. I'm going into my writing cage and getting the work done. And I do write for different audiences. Knowing your audience is one of the most important pieces of writing. And I found that, I used to tell my kids, you do a variety of things to make a boring task fun. Writing is not a boring task, but it is a special task. And I try to arrange my world so that when I go into that space, I can give it my undivided attention and do my best job.
Thank you. Others, and any routines that you find particularly helpful in getting your writing going?
I guess I will offer a complementary perspective to Professor Mincy's. So since I don't have a job where I can set aside that time for writing, for me, it's helpful to try and it's like chip away at it. So my writing will usually, well, first off, I really love writing with partners. That's really helpful for me. So I actually see one of my writing partners is here in this session. So I'll put a link to one of our blog posts in the chat after this. And we will schedule time to write together and then be very structured about it. So like 10 minutes max of chit chat and catching up with each other, and then like solid the next 50 minutes or however much time we have actually write. And for the chipping away at it, I really like to decide what the headers are, and this works for papers too, any students out there. So section headers, and then kind of brainstorming ideas under the section headers, and then turning that into writing. And then going back and ruthlessly cutting, because often there's a lot of overwriting. And when I think it's at a place where I'm happy with it, I read it out loud to check the flow. Because often if I'm reading out loud and I'm stumbling, that means the sentences are too long, or I haven't varied short sentences and long sentences, or things like that, and then stepping away. But having a good writing partner then means we can read over each other's work and say, I'm not clear on this, or could you add more about this? Or because we know each other, we'll say like, when we were talking, you mentioned this, but I don't see it here. Maybe you want to add that in. So the routine is, it's pretty different. So I hope it's helpful to have like a couple different perspectives on that.
Yeah, I can add to that. You just reminded me of something, Mattia. I hate outlining, but I'm happy to do a PowerPoint. So that's often what I'll do before I actually start a writing project. I'll do the PowerPoint because it just forces me to think, what are really the key things that I have to say? And then I use that as an outline, whatever that's worth. But, I think we're getting questions a lot too. Carmela, you can tell us a little bit about your routine.
I think one thing I just wanted to say, because it is, I think it is complementary and slightly different, is that I also think about when am I likely to be productive. And so I've learned I'm really a morning person. I actually really enjoy writing in those morning blocks, and that for me, probably a 2-hour chunk is probably the most that I could do at a time, and really being methodical and structured about it so that it's a time goal. It's not a product goal. I'm not trying to finish the introduction, but I'm trying to spend X amount of time on this section. And then to the extent that you can schedule that in and really identify, like, not just working on a paper, but really I'm going to work on the introduction, or I'm going to work on the methods. And I'm talking about scientific writing here in the context of articles, scientific articles. But I think that really like structured, and I've had to, which is a little bit interesting. And so Ron, we're going to have lunch again and kind of talk about our strategies. I've had to actually on work, like I've had some assumptions about when can I be productive. Like I need to have, I'm a tea drinker, I want to have a cup of tea, it needs to be at this time. And some of the workshops that I've done on writing have been actually, though, sure, that's nice, but it's not necessarily necessary. Like if you think about writing as a practice, right? Or if you're gonna kind of work out, you don't necessarily need to feel like, I think it's a fine line between like setting the right environment and then to motivate you versus sort of doing it and having the motivation come later. So I think that's just one perspective I wanted to offer.
So I think some of the folks who joined us today through Zoom are early in their careers, and they're wondering very likely, how has your writing changed over time? And are there things that you know now that you wish you'd known then? And can you give them tips on that basis? What would you advise them at that point in their careers?
So I think one of the most important things that I've heard this afternoon is that writing is a journey. So the answer to your question is obvious. I learned there are many things I know about writing that I didn't know last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because it's an evolving sort of practice, and I like that use of the word as well. I think one of the important things about writing is to sit down and outline what it is that you're going to write. You can use a PowerPoint or whatever structure you use, so that you set some parameters about the structure of this document, and then you go about trying to walk through in a very deliberate way what it is that you want to say to your audience. My English professor, this was almost 40 years ago, and she was a real card, because she said, and she did this for a reason, she said writing is like fingernail polishing, right? And she did that because there were a lot of men in the room, right? And she knew we would be, it was like a sports analogy turned on its head. But what she meant was, you put your ideas out there and you constantly refine them and refine them and refine them until you get it right. And that to me was one of the most helpful illustrations, because first of all, the analogy got my attention. But the word, I don't have any sisters, I've been married forever, but what do I know about fingernail polishing? But I paid attention to what she said, and I'm very comfortable with getting my ideas out from my head onto the paper and then refining them over time. The other recommendation I would make is, for anyone who writes a lot, don't write. I talk. I've developed over the years, I used a version of a program called Dragon Naturally Speaking. It is now in its 11th or 15th version. So if I have to write more than a paragraph, I will unplug my hands, stick a microphone in my mouth, and dictate what I write, and then refine it and refine it and refine it. It makes me a much faster writer or a better writer, and those are some of the tools that I've learned.
I would just add a couple of things to what Ron said. One thing that I always struggle, whether I'm writing for a newspaper or a technical piece, is the research background. So the more prepared I am with my research in terms of that topic, asking questions, what has already been done, the more I read on those issues, the more ideas I have in terms of how should I be writing about it. So one thing I would say is that for me, at least, research is very important. The more I know, I always feel that I don't know enough on the subject, even though some of the things that I write on, I'm supposed to be an expert, but I often have this feeling that I don't know enough about it. And the second thing, which I think, Ron, you alluded to, is, and that I would tell all my students, is anything you read that's published is not the first version, is not the second draft. It's many drafts have been done in order to write that. So editing is a very important skill. You should be willing to cut all that you've written, and if you have ideas, to write it again. And over time, I found it's very frustrating in the beginning, but the last draft that you have, you'll be very happy with it. And that's going to be, that itself is a satisfaction. And for any piece of writing that you're doing, you see the journey that you've taken just for that piece and how happy you are at the end of it.
If I can add one thing that echoes what Susan was saying earlier, that encouragement of knowing no matter where you are in your career, you have a story to tell that is valuable for other people to hear. So if you are new in your career, earlier in your career, and you want to get started with writing, know that people want to hear the perspectives of early social workers. That's something that's really valuable, especially for folks who are later in their careers and who want to get back in touch with that, or people who are your peers. So wherever you are in your career, just, you don't have to be the world expert on something to be able to contribute something that's actually really valuable for other people to read. And I had put in the chat, the new social worker magazine is always looking for student writers and professional social work perspectives from any point in one's career. And our school's student journal has a blog that's seeking submissions now about doing field work or other work while physical distancing. And I think a lot of folks here probably have experience with that now. So, just documenting your day-to-day experiences can be a real contribution.
Thank you, Mattia, for mentioning the journal, because the Social Work Review, because we do have that here, and the editors have created that blog, which would be great. And I just wanted to emphasize what Ron had said, the idea of saying it out loud. So some of us are less comfortable writing down, more comfortable saying things out loud. So that's an excellent way to start often. And I guess in terms of shortcuts, what have I learned over the years? If I'm thinking about a particular, this is specific to peer-reviewed or grant writing, is knowing what the structure is ahead of time and doing more background research to understand what I'm writing to in terms of a structure and how it's expected to be laid out, if it has to meet a certain set of requirements before I start, so that it helps not have to go back and refit it.
If I can just jump in and add an additional piece of advice that was given to me by my dissertation chair, is to read to write. And so that's really the idea of making whatever you're reading, if you're doing a literature review, an active process, so that you are not going to spend your time reading 30 papers and then sort of stare at a blank piece of paper and then have to go back. So it's and the form that takes can be different, but just this idea of how can you incorporate writing to every part of the research process. And I think the other sort of tip that I think Mattea really talked about or alluded to is this idea that writing shouldn't, we often think about writing as this solitary process, but in fact, it is a social process. And so if you're co-writing or if you're not, how can you establish support around writing to really help you through? And I think that's been really key in my experience. And I think something that I've leveraged, that I probably have leveraged more now than I did when I was in graduate school. And so whether it's exchanging, sharing your, what I call zero drafts, and feeling comfortable once you have something on paper with your colleagues or with your mentors, or if it's organized, protected blocks of writing time, or actually writing together. I think this idea that writing does not have to be a solitary process is helpful.
I would also say that this is obvious, but even though as a very young scholar, I didn't know how to write well, I read a lot. And I think, you learn about writing by reading other people's work. I was a sort of a voracious reader. And so, because you hear things and it becomes a somewhat more organic process when you've heard it, when you've read something and it's just cumbersome to go through, then you learn how difficult, for example, one tool that I learned in the process was long sentences are very difficult to read. And that's one thing to you as a writer, but it's another thing when you read a very long sentence of someone else's work and you ask yourself, what was the point of that? And you can kind of get lost in all the words. So then when you have to come back and do it yourself, you're somewhat more disciplined about, if I'm writing in Word and I see that long blue line that suggests this is a run-on sentence, that's a signal. Nope, that you could go back to that paragraph and say that long sentence in 4 separate sentences, and you'll be doing the reader a favor. So.
You just reminded me of that great quote. I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, right? It takes a while to. I have to ask, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in now, how has COVID and all the attendant major changes to our lives, how has that affected your writing? How has it affected your productivity? And in general, how do you keep up your productivity and motivation?
Well, maybe I'll start. Every day I feel that I'm very lucky to have work, because right in the beginning of the epidemic, I was just, every few minutes I was looking into the news, all the various cases, and I couldn't focus. And I guess many of us, especially me, I feel that my productivity is less, I can't focus, but I'm so grateful that I have these writing things to do. I have work, which is kind of takes me away. And oftentimes now I manage to kind of focus on things, and I kind of feel I do a lot of work nowadays. There's nothing else to do, but I kind of feel that writing as well as other things and working on COVID related issues is kind of my escape from the situation that we're in.
So I would say I'm almost embarrassed to say that the COVID-19 virus has not affected my productivity in the least, because I'm a cancer survivor. When I had cancer in 2008, I came back to school and said, on Mondays, I will do whatever you want me to do as a faculty member. On Tuesdays, I teach, but the rest of the week, leave me alone, because I have to learn how to cook. I have to make sure that the food that I prepare is going to keep my more than 10 years of surviving cancer. And so I developed this routine. And the COVID-19, I work at home for most of the time, and therefore the COVID being, working in place, I realized, first of all, how privileged I am that I can work at home, and this has been an uninterrupted. On Mondays and Tuesdays, I'm doing what I need to do, and on Wednesday, except for now, I go into my writing zone, and there I am. So it's enabled me to keep in practice the things that I've learned as a writer, and I sort of reach out to other people and make sure that I take care of my family's needs and my friends' needs. I have a good friend right now whose brother may well pass away from the coronavirus, but I've been able to keep my routine in place and continue to write and work. So, but it was really clear to me again how privileged we are that, or I am, that I'm not in a career or a skill. One of the reasons why the coronavirus is affecting people of color so dramatically is because they are working in areas that are in food delivery and a whole variety of things where they have to be out there. And I'm privileged, and I understand that. But it's part of my research, it's part of the work that I do, and it's part of the ways of communicating. I, as an expert in this area, can say, well, wait a minute, maybe the coronavirus maybe the reasons for the high rates of mortality among people of color have less to do with their pre-existing conditions than with the fact that they are working in low-skilled jobs they are heavy in the hospital sector, they are heavy in the food delivery sector, and so they're much more exposed than the rest of the population. And as a consequence, part of the high rates of mortality have everything to do with that. And I'm writing a blog about this right now.
I'll just jump in quickly and say that's amazing, Ron, to think about it in that way, and that you said you were embarrassed to say that, because I think it's fantastic that you're able to keep up the routine. I'm embarrassed to say that I have not been very productive at all in the last 5 weeks, but it's taken me these 5 weeks to reorient to the new environment, to be able to find a way to start to carve out time. So I think, and taking everything you said to heart, that I have a job, and Neeraj said it, how grateful I am to have all of the opportunities presented at this time when we're aware as social workers and writers about many of these pandemic issues being related to the underlying social conditions that we study. on an ongoing basis. But I've been struggling with questions about how important is what I want to write about right now compared to what's happening at the local hospital and in the city. So some of that has really interfered with my capacity to stay focused, to work on a writing task, but I'm finding that over time it's getting a little bit easier to get back to that. So I don't have the same discipline that you've developed, and it's inspiring to hear about and to try to put into practice.
And I'll jump in and say, you know, kind of echoing Professor Liddy, I've also not been very productive writing-wise during this period, but I have been pretty productive in thinking about things I want to write about. And this might be happening with all of you, where you're like, I wish someone would write about this, and oh, I could write about that, or this or that aspect of life right now is interesting. It would be good to write about it. So I think it kind of mirrors how sometimes in life you have more time to sit down and write, or more time to generate ideas for future writing. Because I see one of the Q&A questions is, you know, if you're parents of small children right now, that is really challenging with childcare, and there are gender dimensions of what, you know, folks are expected to do at home. And so maybe right now is a time to just sketch out ideas or write down ideas and that you'll later have time to flesh out, but you want to capture some of the thoughts right now so that you remember them later, because time is moving so quickly, and it's so easy to forget perspectives that you wanted to capture.
And I think I'll jump in to echo some of, I think, what Matea just said in terms of thinking about the writing process as a long process. And, you know, if you're not, and it's been hard, my productivity has definitely taken a hit. I have a 2-year-old at home who's also a morning person. So there you go. There's my routine. And I think one of the key things is just being kind and gentle to yourself, and really thinking about, well, what are your new writing goals in light of this change? And I think focusing on generating ideas is still worthwhile, and trying to carve out time. I think, like Susan, it's feeling like, okay, I think I can start to you know, to start to think about how I now structure my time to work on these tasks, while also being mindful of the issues that I really care about, and being actively contributing to that. So I think I just want to sort of echo being gentle and kind in this moment, and rethinking what those, redefining what those goals are in light of the pandemic, I think is really important.
I think it's a really good point, because a lot of people have seen their goals, feels like they're crashing by the wayside, but I think you have to put a different spin on it and say, okay, well, how am I going to shift these goals to stay productive? Another question I saw pop up in the Q&A, and I think you named this, Carmela, the imposter syndrome. And I think a lot of you might have felt that over time. And there's a question of, how did you overcome that? How do you deal with that?
I'm happy to start answering, but I think Susan really said it well when she said that, you know, it's something that you still continue to struggle with. I'm not sure that, like, you overcome it completely. I think what's been really helpful is just seeing that writing process demystified. And so seeing senior people, I think in some ways this panel hopefully does that for you, which is, you know, seeing how senior faculty, administrators really struggle with their writings, or with their writing. They face challenges and they come up with strategies to deal with it. And I think one of the key experiences I had was as a postdoc, and being a part of this really productive scientific team where, like, literally you were writing together. And can you imagine sort of writing with Ron Mincy? This is the equivalent, right, of being in graduate school, and you're, you know, it's like a relay, and now the document is going to you, and you get to see what I was exposed to is, you know, the senior person's half-baked ideas and fragments. And it really, to me, was just a fundamental shift in what it means to be, you know, a tenured, at the moment in time when that happened, when I was a postdoc, this tenured, really senior full professor, you know, sort of put out the insecurities, or write in a way that I'm like, I can write that way. So it's sort of really being able to demystify that process and make it relatable was really helpful. And I think so seeking out opportunities where you can really get feedback, be open to receiving feedback, and participate in co-author projects, I think is really important.
What I've found often is that, you know, when I'm trying to write a piece and I'm just lost, it often helps me to stop writing and start thinking about it. You know, sit back instead of just writing the same sentences on the computer. So I'll just give you a small example how technology has helped and hurt me over time. When I was a journalist, oftentimes I would have as a reporter a deadline at 8 o'clock, and I attended in the evening, and the press conference ended at 6 o'clock. So I'm on my way to my office and I'm thinking of the sentences that I'm going to write. So the introduction, so all the lines were in my mind. I would come to office and start working on a typewriter. We didn't have computers in the office for everybody, and I was pretty junior, so I never got a chance to work on a computer. So I didn't have the chance to make a mistake. And now many, many years later, I find that I begin to think when I have my fingers on the keyboard. I don't think ahead of time because I feel like I have the luxury of changing the sentences, writing them again and again. And I often find that when I'm lost, if I just sit back and start thinking of what do I want to do really, that helps me oftentimes.
Carmela and I have this running joke. Her son was born within a few weeks of my grandson. And I realized that, you know, when my sons were 2 years old, I used to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning so that I could devote that time to writing. And then when they woke up, I was, you know, my field of research is on fathers. So it was very important for me to be available to my kids. And I couldn't do that if I'm trying to sneak away to get some writing done. So I would try to organize my life around what were priorities for me. And I realized that Carmela, forget it. If your son is a morning person, you're done. You can't write at 8 o'clock. That's not it. And so I also appreciate that many students now who are parents and who have children at home, it feels impossible. And part of it is trying to rearrange our lives in such a way as we sort of, we take care of the things that are really important, and your work and your study is somewhere in those priorities, but you also take care of the people who are important to you. And then, and as long as you are organizing your priorities and getting the most important things done, then you can walk away at the end of the day and really feel, okay, I've done what I'm supposed to do. I've met my responsibilities, and sleep at night. And I think that's really, really important.
This has just been great. And I'm sorry to say we have 4 minutes left. So I just wanted to give everybody, perhaps in reverse alpha order this time, just any closing thoughts you have for our audience today. So I'm going to start with you, Susan.
Sure. Well, this feels like it could be the beginning of a longer conversation. So maybe we can entice Adam and Chin to consider an ongoing dialogue that would address different aspects of what we covered today. But just to follow up with what we were just talking about with regard to sort of getting stuck, or the imposter syndrome, I think increasingly over the years, I find that where I can, as many have said, reading, if I get stuck, reading, but also connecting to the community about which I'm writing. So depending on the purpose of the writing, whether it's a grant or if it's a peer-reviewed piece, if it's not community-based participatory research, there might be more limitations to how to get in touch with the community, but going back to remember that I'm borrowing voice, or I'm giving voice to others. And so staying connected to that process in whatever form that might take, whether it's organizing a focus group, or getting in touch with your research team, or reviewing the data again, trying to find ways to be very mindful to connect with the communities and the individuals with whom I've been tasked or taken power to give voice to in the name of. So that's something that I just wanted to say at the end. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Ron, any last closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would say I would, really want to turn this idea of an imposter syndrome on its head. And for those students who come and who haven't had a good preparation in writing as part of their secondary school and undergraduate training, I want to think about the things that you know about the communities that you study, and about the people you care about. You know some things about those communities and those people, and policy is being made on their behalf. And you have a level of expertise about those environments that many people who write about them do not. And in fact, your expertise is needed. And that's probably one of the most important reasons why you should become a better writer, because you have a set of expertise that those who make policy about those communities, Carmela, you sit around lots of tables where there are researchers and policymakers, and you are the single Latina in that room. Over my last 40 years, I've been the single African-American person in the room when policy is being made. And I think it's really critical for people who have come from similar backgrounds to acquire the skill sets that they need so that they can influence the way policy is made, the way services are rendered, and becoming a good writer in some sense is your duty. To allow your expertise to be expressed to the people who are making decisions that affect the people that you care about.
Thank you very much, Ron. Mattia.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. First of all, I know everyone's time is really valuable, and that's something we've even talked about here. So this has been really wonderful. And I guess I'd really like to echo Ron's point about the value of your perspective, because some of what folks are saying is, I'm not sure that I have something to write, or, talking about imposter syndrome, but your perspective is so important. And if you think about, especially for the social workers who are here, the need for social work voices to be more in the public dialogue. So if, a journal article seems daunting, what about a letter to the editor that's 500 words? What about an op-ed that's 750 words? What about a blog post that can be shorter or longer? And all those publications need your voices. They want to publish you. So, you can pitch an idea to an editor if you don't have time to write something out and then submit it. Just pitch the idea. And, the value of your perspective is just so essential for you, for your colleagues, for just the overall general public conversation.
Thanks, Mattia. Neeraj? You're still muted.
I really appreciate the points that the earlier three speakers, Mattia, Susan, and Ron had made. And I echo them, but I would just add one thing, that just be open to criticism. Remember, however harsh it is, just be open to it, because remember that this is a contribution to your own journey that is always forward, at least in terms of writing. That's it.
Thank you. Carmela, you actually really get the last word.
Well, I feel like I have very little to add, and just want to echo what everyone has said before in terms of your voice matters, and finding your voice and being open and receptive to feedback. And I just want to end, I think, being a good writer to me is about being a clear writer and being willing, like I mentioned before, to be vulnerable, to be open to criticism, and to put in, I think, the hard work to get better on this journey. And so, again, thank you for everybody who joined. I completely agree with Susan. A follow-up would be terrific.
That sounds like a great idea to me. I'd like everybody to just thank our panelists with your virtual applause, if you would. I think it's been an incredibly useful and an enjoyable discussion today. We're really grateful for your time and wisdom, and thank you everybody for being here.